building and you walk in, and could you describe, what your expectations are and what was there for you for instruments and what the producers gave you to read from and that sort of thing?
Well, first of all, there was always keyboards for us. There was always pianos or electric pianos, or that's when the rental companies started, SIR, Ryder Sound. They would have units that could be rented, but they also charged cartage fees. And the musicians later on were getting cartage for even carrying their amps, and $3 or $6 they would fill out a paper. And then eventually the cartage companies took over that. And when you were producing, you had to write that into your budget because that was part of it. Fortunately, I never had to mess with any of that stuff. There was always keyboards for me to play. When you went to the session, you would leave in the morning. Most of the sessions might start at 10. If it was the rock and rollers, it started a little later in the day. But if you were doing like for Capitol Records or for one of those major companies, they were in and out real fast. They were on the clock because that's the way it was. They had to bring in dates. You had to be capable of doing 3 to 4 songs in 3 hours. And that was routine. And if you went a half hour over, oh my God, they were, what's going to happen to my next budget? We didn't realize this. I never realized it till 20 years later that was the reason that all that pressure was on. And everything had to be done. I mean, the copyists, there was no computers in those days, so all the music was hand copied. Somebody would copy and then make copies after that. But if you saw some of my scores that I did, they're chicken scratches, you're writing fast and you're doing stuff like that. Now somebody's got to decipher that for the string players, for the horn players and stuff like that. So the copyists were a very, very important part of that whole thing. That music had to be copied. A lot of times you'll go into producers that didn't like to do it that way, and most of it was chord sheets. That you'd see the chords written out, and you might have a scratch track of the vocal, what it was, or the producer knew it. But most of the producers didn't know the direction. Everybody was in a room like this, and I'd like to have a nickel for how many times somebody made a mistake. And so, who did that? And let's go with that. That was better when he originally had thought. And that becomes the hook of the record, And all of a sudden, it came out of nowhere. It came out of somebody making a mistake, improvising, and saying, I think I'll change this chord this time and see what happens. And fortunately, a lot of times it worked out. Sometimes it didn't. They said, no, don't do that. But generally speaking, they would rely on us, and it would go. And we would be creating, most of the jazz players and the heavy rock and roll players, they were used to improvising. That's all they did was improvising. And that was creative for us. All those records got a piece of us. We were able to help it develop. The main thing, like I'll be talking to kids and they'll say, I want to, how do you get in the studios and everything? And they all listen to one radio station. And that's the biggest mistake in the world. Because if somebody asks you, and it happened over and over again with us, could you play it a little more like Floyd Kramer? What they were trying to say is a little more how they would do it in Nashville. But they loved that Floyd Kramer piano sound. Or if they said, could you make it a little more dark? And they wouldn't say it, but they wanted Ray Charles, a kind of a funkier version. When you had a producer that really knew what he was doing, he could verbalize it. He would tell you exactly what it was. But most of the young producers, they were starting out as well as everybody else. And it was seek and find.
Would you do, how many run-throughs would you do of a song before they would?
Well, if you worked for Phil Spector, it was like a 9-hour run-through or an 8-hour run-through. You never stopped. It was over and over and over again. As a matter of fact, he would tell Hal Blaine, the drummer, I don't want any fills till I tell you to play fills. The end of Phil Spector's records, you'll hear great drum licks and all this stuff happening. And he would tell Hal to wait till everything else was there because he didn't want Hal to wear himself out. Everybody else was ready to die, but Hal, he saved Hal for the ends so that he could play those fills and set up everything. And you knew when Hal started to play the fills that he was happy, that Phil Spector was happy with what was going on, and now we've come to the end. So it was very tedious. When you worked for Phil or for Brian Wilson in the same week, man, you were good for the month. I mean, and what's really interesting is that Brian Wilson and Phil Spector, everything was on union contracts. Every note we played for those guys, as that I can remember, went on a contract. So that later on in our lives, when you get older, those residuals come back to you. It's based on those contracts, because there were contracts. And we're very fortunate they were like that, and they kind of forced everybody else to do it that way. If these independent guys can do it, we better stay in shape, because if they can get away with it, they would. And then everybody else had to follow suit. And it was a great time for us, because everything went on a union contract, and you got the union scale, which wasn't very much at that point, but it was rising. It was getting better. And it went on, to this very day. You'll get a check. I don't care if it's for $1 or it's for $300. If that wasn't on the contract, nobody would know about it. They'd get away with it. So it's there.
You were telling a story about God Only Knows. I think it was that, that you fell asleep with your finger.
No, it was on Good Vibrations.
Oh, Good Vibrations.
Oh, yeah. Then I think what's the funniest part about it, Brian didn't know about it till about 5 years ago. And he calls me and says, "Is that true? I hear this story." And I said, "Yeah, it's true." He says, "Well, how come I didn't see it?" There were baffles, these giant baffles in Studio 3, and the Hammond B3 that I was playing was behind the baffles. So all I could hear was the talk back. "Don, I need you to just hold with your foot, hold that low note, and the rest of the guys take a break." And this is after like 8 or 9 hours. And I'm like this, I'm gonna keep my break. And I look over and there's that pillow. It was sitting right there. I used to use it, or we would use it to put it on top of the bench, that bench that they use for the organ. So he says, "Just 1 second." I stood up real quick and grabbed the pillow and stuck it right onto where the note I was holding on the foot pedals, and I laid down. And my head was playing that one note, some low, silly note that he was orchestrating. That was the bottom part of this whole great vocal thing that he was doing. I didn't know that, 'cause that's Brian Wilson. And sure, he says, "Just keep holding it, and I fell asleep. I mean, I went out like that, at least for 5 minutes, And the next thing I heard was click, click. "Don, thanks, that was great," And as I got up, I said, "Okay," and I'm walking out, and Hal Blaine was there. He was looking in the door window at Studio 3. He said, "Do you have a nice nap, Don?" He knew that I went out. Nobody else could see it. So that was it. It happened.